All right, welcome everybody. I am so unbelievably over the moon excited to share this trap I found, this opening trap in the mainline Yugoslav attack against the Sicilian Dragon proper. It occurs on move 26. It is this 11 move combination that I found using Alpha Zero. And if you can just remember these, 11 moves and 26 moves to get there, you will be able to say Dracaris and breathe fire on the board to your opponent. Actually, no, that's not what this series is about. So this series is going to be about practical chess opening traps. So let's jump in and let's examine what practical is for the adult improver. So what do I mean when I say practical opening trap? Well, to me, practical means it's worthy of study for an adult improver that has limited time and needs to allocate their time efficiently. So the way I see it, there's two main components to practical opening traps. So the first element that I think makes a trap practical is how likely it is to occur in our games as club players. If it rarely comes up, we don't necessarily want to waste our time studying it. It doesn't do us any good to study some traps that come up between titled players on move 29 and some mainline opening, right? It's kind of obvious, but that's something that I myself, as I'm learning openings, I want to be able to allocate my time well. So how often will it come up? So my thought is you want to start with traps that are more likely to come up. Element number 2, does understanding this trap and learning this trap, does that help your understanding of the opening that you're playing? Does it illustrate key concepts that you can use to understand the opening even better? And maybe it even helps you understand other openings. There could be a cross-pollination of ideas. For instance, I've committed to playing the London system until I gain 200 rating points. That's the only thing I'm going to play with white. I've committed to that. I've also committed to playing the Slav defense. Now, there are a lot of commonalities between those two openings. For instance, you may find, as white in the London system, you may have traps where you get a double attack on the b7 square, a pawn on b7 and a pawn on d5. And the corollary for black would be, if you're playing the Slav, you may get double attacks on white's b2 pawn and white's d4 pawn. And so that is another factor I consider practical if it helps you understand ideas to get a better grasp of your opening. So with that being said, I play the London system and the Slav, and then I play the Scandinavian, and I may be playing some other openings as well against e4. But I am committed until I gain at least 200 rating points to play in the London and the Slav. So in this series, my point is to better learn as I'm learning these openings and I come across different traps that I think are helpful. My goal is to make videos out of them, and as I'm making the video, also explain the opening so we can learn some stuff, some of the key ideas from the opening. We don't want to be just memorizing traps for the sake of memorizing traps. I do not think that is an efficient use of time. You'd be better off studying other elements of the game like tactics or endgame. But if we can do it in a way where we further our understanding of the openings we play, then I think it's actually useful. So let's get my ugly mug off the screen here. Let's roll up our sleeves and let's look at the first opening trap that we're going to cover. For our first episode of practical opening traps, I wanted to choose a trap that met both of our criteria for being practical. I wanted it to be likely to occur in an actual game, and I wanted it to help in our understanding of the opening. And so one thing you'll notice here on the screen is we have a picture of the Lichess database, and I'm going to have that open as I record this video. And what you can notice, and I'll point this out as well as we go, but every move for black is one of the top 2 choices for black. It's one of the 2 most frequent moves they make. And I have this set to club players in the Lichess database. And then as we go, I'll try to point out some key ideas in the London system. And what I wanted to do for the first opening that we look at for traps against was the Chigorin Defense. Because at club level, we're going to face that a ton. And the London system is actually perfect against the Chigorin Defense. And we'll kind of talk about why that is. But if we can really tee off on this Chigorin Defense, that'll help us score a lot of points. So let's get into looking at this opening trap. And this Chigorin Defense is a response of knight to c6 after we've played d4 and d5. And this is actually, if we go back and look, you can see this is the second most common move by club players. It's actually just barely under the frequency of knight to f6. So this is the most common, but just barely behind it is knight to c6. And so that's why it's critical that we know how to play against the Chigorin, and it's worth looking at some traps, because there are a bunch of traps for the Chigorin. I don't have a lot of respect for the Chigorin. I think it kind of sucks, actually. So that's why I think it's like important for us London players to kind of, every time we see this, kind of smile and see it as an opportunity to just kind of tee off on this thing. So, of course, we're London players, so we play f4. And now if we look at the moves played again, we can see the second most common move played is bishop to f5. So there's different ways that Chigorin players will play, but when they play knight to c6, they are putting additional support right away on e5. And we know that e5 is an important square in the London, and they would love nothing more than to just hammer that through right away to be able to play e5. Fortunately for us, our London bishop goes a long ways on this diagonal to stopping that. So the Chigorin isn't as effective against the London as it is against the regular Queen's Gambit lines where we would play d4 and c4. And when we see black play bishop to f5, we just want to note that he is delaying the development of his g8 knight. And he may not develop this to f6. He may be intending to develop this to e7. But one thing that we want to note is that because black took control of this diagonal, it's more difficult for us as white from the London to attack on the king side. Because normally we would want our bishop to go out to d3 and aid in a king side attack. But this bishop is going to blunt that attack for us. And so we shift our attention to the other side of the board because black was able to contest this diagonal and provide support to his king side and make it more difficult for us to attack over there. But there's consequences for that. And so one thing that we want to look at as we study our openings is the consequences of the moves that are played. So as I see it, a big consequence of this move here is that black is no longer supporting b7. So b7 is actually now unprotected. And so this is going to have major consequences as we go through this opening trap and this opening in general. And so just make a mental note for now that b7 is unprotected. So because it's going to be difficult for us to whip up a kingside attack because he is contesting this diagonal, what we want to do is we want to shift our attention towards creating play on the queen side as quickly as we can. So we're going to hit him right away with c4. And then if we look at the database here, we can see by far the most common response is e6, and that makes sense. They're trying to support this pawn on d5. And so what we are going to do is we just take this pawn And we clarify the structure. And one thing we want to note is that we gained their e-pawn and we gave up our c-pawn. So we gained a central pawn for a flank pawn. And just as a general rule of thumb, pawns towards the center are more valuable than pawns as you go out towards the rims. So a rook pawn is worth a lot less than a central pawn, especially in the opening and in the middle game. So, of course, when we take, black takes back. The most common response is to take back with the e-pawn. They wouldn't want to take back with the queen and let us gain time on their queen by playing knight to c3. So they take back with the e-pawn. And then we develop our knight and we just continue to put pressure on the center. And their most common move played is knight to f6. And I think this would be a good point to just kind of take stock in this position, because if you just glance at this position, it almost looks like a mirror image. But there's one major difference here. We have this extra central pawn, and they have this c-pawn. But this c-pawn is stuck behind this knight. So it can't be used to support the center or to like strike out at our center right now, because it is stuck behind this knight. And I think this is like the critical flaw of the Chigorin. And this is one of the reasons, the Scandinavian is, or I'm sorry, the London is so good against this thing. So we just continue to develop. We support the center. We allow our bishop to develop. So we're getting close to fully developed here. And not to sound like a broken record, but compare our e-pawn to that c-pawn. Our e-pawn is playing an active role in supporting that center. And we're going to see here very shortly why that is important, because it's going to free our other pieces up to take other actions and not be stuck trying to protect the center, because our e-pawn is doing that task for us tremendously well. Now, let's look at this. This is the second most common move. So every move we've played so far is either the most common move or the second most common move by black. So this is like a high probability that if you play this way as white, you could get this position here on the board. So bishop to d6, the second most common move. Now I think what they want you to do is trade that bishop off. But we're not going to be so cooperative. And I think what we want to do here is we want to just kind of take a look at this position, and let's look at the consequence of this move here. Let's look at the consequence of bishop to d6. So as I see it, one major consequence of this move is that this bishop on d6 physically obstructs the queen's protection of d5. So now we've noted a couple consequences already, and if we tie these two together, we can come up with a really good move here, a move that puts us in a very, very good position. So remember, our first consequence was that black, by playing bishop to f5, took away protection of b7. So b7 is not protected. Okay. And by playing bishop to d6, they took away the queen's protection of d5. So how do we tie those two together? Because in the opening, a lot of times we have these advantages that can disappear quite quickly if we don't make use of them. But this one, let's tie them together, and let's make the move that actually is great here. It's a trap. Bam! We play bishop to g5. And so what does this do? It's probably not a move that black was expecting. Obviously, they wouldn't have played this if they counted on this. They wouldn't have played bishop to d6 if they fully understood the consequence of impeding the protection of d5. But what we're doing is we are indirectly taking away support of this d5 pawn, because we have the knight pinned to the queen. And so our simple threat in this position is just to take on f6, and when black recaptures, we take with the knight. And we win a pawn for nothing. Like, they don't even have compensation for it. So what's interesting, if we look at this position, let's look over here at the database, and let's look at the top 3 moves played in the database. So the most common move played in the database is h6. And we can see that, unfortunately for black, that's just a losing move. We just take, and bam, we take on d5. It doesn't matter if he takes with the pawn, it makes no difference. We take that free pawn. So that's the most common thing played, is h6. The next most common, the second most common move, is castling. Well, in that case, we have our choice of how we want to do it. We couldn't just go bang, take that knight, or the knight takes the pawn because black's f6 knight is pinned. Or if we want to, we could even throw that in first and then take. So it's kind of like a smorgasbord of how we want to go. Now, we go back to this position. The third most common move, if they realize that, oh, this thing is blocking the protection of d5, then we have another important theme comes in. And this is especially useful if you play the Slav as well as the London. And this is why I'm playing the Slav in addition to the London, is because you have this cross-pollination of ideas between the Slav and the London. But if the player realizes and they say, okay, well, I'm going to play bishop to e7 because I'm going to reopen the queen's protection of the d5 pawn, well, then we actually have another very thematic idea. And what that is we are going to take that knight, and when they recapture, bam, queen to b3. And this is an extremely important idea in the London system in the Slav. We unveil a double attack on d5 and b7. And there's simply just no way for black to respond to both threats. So white wins a pawn here, no matter what black does. And so those are a couple of important themes that we learned from this trap. We learn a bit about this opening. We learn why the Chigorin is not an ideal setup against the London system. And, you know, just go ahead and replay this, kind of look at this yourself, but just notice every single move was one of the top 2 responses for black. So it is not unlikely that you would get this position in your games if you choose to play this way with white. So that's what I'm doing. I'm committed to trying to learn this London system. I want to try to understand this opening, learn some of these traps, see if I can apply any of these ideas I learn from these traps just to understanding the opening better. And so that's what this series is going to do. We're just going to look at different traps. We're going to see if we can learn anything that we can apply to our understanding of the opening from these traps. And we're going to try to focus initially on ones that are more likely to occur, that are commonly played by club players. So I hope you guys found that useful. I'll be making more videos about these practical opening traps, and we'll see you at the next one.